Yes, equity and access do get circulated quite a bit. I think there's ways in which equity is discussed in a way that's synonymous with access, and they're not necessarily the same thing. Equity is also conflated many times with, diversity and inclusion or social justice. But the way in which we frame it and how I think about it is more of equity being a process, and this process by which we try to identify what are the gaps, what are the barriers to students' educational opportunities on the basis of, their group membership. So on the basis of a marginalized membership such as race and ethnicity and gender, socioeconomic status, LGBTQ, nationality, right? So age, those things, I think when we talk about equity is really about this process of how we identify the blockages to educational opportunities as well as the completion of students per those marginalized group memberships, and then how we think through subsequently what are going to be some strategic approaches. What are the action steps by which we readily address that and then do so in a way that's ongoing, that's systemic, and that is scalable, right, and sustaining? Well, I think equity minded, and a lot of times in our shop, we talk about equity consciousness, right? But I think those two go hand in hand, and I'm very comfortable with those being, euphemisms for one another. So when we talk about equity consciousness, again, it's this extent to which we are very intentional and deliberate in our approaches and understanding that broadening participation is not enough, and that access alone is not the panacea or presents this silver bullet for how we broaden participation, and then how students are able to navigate, have navigational capital to move through, just in, through, and out of our schools. And so I think when we're, kind of speaking to different constituents, if you will, we also try to keep in mind that equity is not a universal concept. We really need, not just, in higher ed, I think K-12 suffers from this as well. Our policy realm, researchers, there hasn't been a real level setting, right? In terms of when we say equity, what does that really entail? Who does that really include? There's a good scholar friend of mine, D.L. Stewart. So D.L. Stewart does this really wonderful kind of unpacking of these terms, right? So, what is equity? What is equality? How equity and equality are in conversation with one another in contrast to diversity and inclusion, and then what social justice has to say. And it's this conversation that plays out in a piece that was written by D.L. in Inside Higher Ed. And then also in distinguished diversity lecture that was done at the University of Illinois. I would suggest anybody, P through 20, take a look at that, because it is a primer on how we can think through the terminology, but it gives you a sense of forward, motion, like next steps, a call to action about how to make this actualize in terms of equitable student outcomes. The way in which equity shows up is very different. I think that it's very contextual. And so on one hand, while there's a lot of similarity in some of the issues, the challenges in 2-year and 4-year alike, I think it plays out differently in each context, though there's some overlap. Similarly, I would say the same in terms of if you say a day in the life of a faculty member or a staff member, or someone who is a senior level administrator versus an entry level professional or mid-career person, that there are nuances in terms of their station as well as their placement within a space, within a particular context, and then also within that, that kind of area that they reside in terms of the geographic location too, because the culture is more open in certain parts of the country than it is in others. And so how all of this stuff kind of plays out is different because the demographics are different. The politics of identity are different. There's also differences and nuances in terms of resource dependencies, fiscal, facilities, human resources, you name it, right? And so I think the challenges surrounding equity are variable. And I think they're just as variable as the definition of equity itself, in terms of, again, us needing to do some level setting kind of across sectors around what that looks like. And I think part of the tension may be that it isn't one size fits all. And there's a way in which people will think about equity as one and the same as, equality. But really what it's about is equity is a means by which we address inequities and inequality, right? And so they're part and parcel, though mutually exclusive, at the same time. I think some of the things that we could do to keep equity, kind of frontal lobe, is to be very accountable, to hold ourselves accountable. I can't tell you how many times I've talked with folks, whether it's 2 or 4 year, and we do a good job, particularly because of all of the reporting that's required of our institutions, right? Jumping through the hoops of, getting my iPads report in and all of that. So we have this data. We're collecting data ad nauseum. We collect it and we don't connect it. We are not connecting the data points, and we're not doing it in a way that's strategic, that can help us to have granular understanding and pinpoint equity gaps. And I intentionally say equity gaps and not achievement gaps, and not race ethnic group gaps, because this is institutionalized, it's systemic, right? And so because it's embedded and woven into the fabric of our very institutions, it requires a deliberateness that we have to be vigilant about. And so for a faculty member, to what extent are you employing culturally responsive pedagogies, right? How are you seeing your students? Can they come into that class setting as their whole self, right? And sit in the nexus of all of those different multiple group identities and feel affirmed in that. For the advisor, the extent to which, I hate to say intrusive advising, because who wants to be intruded upon? but to the extent that there is a nurturance that, again, beyond the student affairs unit, that all educators within the post-secondary context are providing that wraparound support that students need. So I think those are just a couple different ways in terms of policy and programmatically, in terms of practice, the extent to which we can get to a place where we are being very much more aggressive in how we hold ourselves accountable to making sure that there can be as seamless as possible a transition for students. We have really still grappled with how to really deal with and accommodate student mobility in terms of student swirl. Multi-institutional attendance is here to stay. We got to figure out how to catch up with what is our now and what is going to continue to trend, and figure out a way where students, as well as community colleges in particular, are not treated disparagingly in what has been age-old metrics for how we talk about student success and who's taken part in the success of their completion. Yes and no. Yes, I think some folks are scared to unpack it. In a session earlier, we were talking about just that, where I'd spoken with an administrator who said, well, we don't look at our data by race and ethnicity or gender. We don't do these subgroup analyses of sorts as you talk about. And so my thought was, well, you say you pride yourself on, being equity minded, equity conscious. How is it that you can identify equity gaps if you don't readily unpack your data and disaggregate it in this manner? And the response was, oh, well, I guess we ought to, and I think sometimes we do have institutions where there is a culture of inquiry, but there's also an overload in terms of the amount of data, trying to collect the data as a means, right, to, again, get the report done, to get it in. But we've not had the luxury of the time in some cases to really make sense of the data, to do that sense making, and to take that to do some planning in terms of strategy and think through how to create those strategic plans that then can move into implementation phase. And so I think that, there's any number of reasons why it gets cumbersome, for folks to really reconcile what to do with their data. In some cases, they don't have the capacity. In other cases, they feel like they're drowning in data and they don't even know where to start. And in some cases, it is, I think maybe a fear of if I pull the veneer, back and lift it off, what am I going to see? And do I even really want to deal with what it is? Ooh, that's hard. I mean, you got to scroll because I could just, there's a plethora, right? It's a litany of things that I think we could attend to. And I don't know that there's the silver bullet or magic wand around like the one thing that would then give us this producing of equitable student outcomes. Right. Well, I think a couple things come to mind. One is in terms of affordability, right? Our first question started out with, let's talk about equity and access. And there's inequitable access to post-secondary education. And part of, the gap in terms of attainment is, the access point. And we can't broaden participation and bolster access across different student groups without talking about affordability. So for me, right up there is this joint conversation and not a siloed one, that when we talk access, that the very next thing we're also kind of coupling that with is talking about affordability, because that is one of the major, it's an impasse to folks being able to not only start, but to finish. And so the other part would be the way in which we think through what is learning. I think we have some inequities that we're so busy counting up units and credits and not thinking about competencies and learning, prior learning credit and thinking outside the box. So what we could do if we really want to advance equity is step outside the frame, color outside the lines, and come up with more creative ways that will also help us chip away at what we're seeing in terms of credit loss, time to degree completion, indebtedness. I mean, that alone would kind of check a couple boxes, right? And I think lastly, in terms of equity and kind of going back to the initial question about equity and access, and I don't know that this is a conversation that's really reached community colleges, and I don't know if it's where people might think it's moot because these are open door institutions, but certainly open doors and open access. And just because you got your foot in the door doesn't mean that students are having an on-ramp and have a pathway for what it is they most desire. And so I think that particularly in those high skill, high demand, high wage, those CTE areas, we need to think about what equity looks like. Do we have it? Because we do see a disconnect between at the secondary level, who are the participants, and then who's accessing the programs and who's completing the programs at a post-secondary level. And so I think maybe holistic review. We hear a lot about holistic review in terms of admissions, but again, it's been a very elite kind of dialogue and a conversation that some of our four-year sister partner schools that are, comprehensive state teaching institutions or our community colleges have not been a part of that conversation, but could benefit from thinking about, particularly in some of those more competitive programs like nursing, like pre-engineering, how do we look at the whole student? How might we employ holistic, admissions review, and even with our financial aid in terms of holistic review relative to scholarships, because we have so many marginalized, underserved, first generation, minoritized students, at community colleges. Ooh, let's see, that's good. What have I been working on lately? Well, let's see. There's a few things. Exciting is our new Gates grant to embed equity in the guided pathways. And so it's called EC3P. So kind of like the C is cubed for equity conscious community college pathways. So we have a lot of different layers in that. And so that's been exciting to see how that is kind of unpacking and unfolding. One in particular, a piece of it, I guess I could highlight, is that we're going to have what's called CC All. So CC All in terms of community college, all access all the time for all folks. And so starting in May, we'll start releasing what will be our video vignettes on exploring equity and engaging in excellence, as well as a new podcast series that'll be coming forth with that as well. We're doing some really good work with some partners from Highline Community College, Helen Byrne, Luke Wood at San Diego State University, and Vilma Mesa at University of Michigan, around how we transition students to calculus. And so some of the aha moments for me was just in some of the field work. Again, understanding that Dev Math, developmental ed in general is very pervasive, but the extent to which, students are, I was like, there's a 084 class, like that exists. And how students are really trying to traverse, 3, 4, 5 different Dev Math classes, seeking and preparing to qualify. And we're interested in those stories in terms of not the deficit, but who's made it over and through, right? And so some of our work is looking at and positioning transition theory and how students are moving in, through, and out of, and what are the supports, the self, the situation, and the strategies around it. Because, again, math is a gateway or it could be a gatekeeper. Some other stuff that's really interesting that we're working on is we just found out, it's barely 4 weeks old, that we have a new grant from the Lumina Foundation to do advancing racial justice in community college institutes. And so there will be various institutes around the country this summer that will do, thank you Lumina, where we talk about the racialized campus climate for community college students.
Wow, that's a lot. So not much going on for you.
Yeah. But we're having fun. I have a great team, and I'm just excited that we're able to engage in work that is meaningful and that we hope people find has utility. Sure thing. Yep. At occrl.edu. And then I would be remiss if I did not mention the Illinois Community College Board, who has been a long time supporter of the office and very critical to how we've been able to branch beyond Illinois to make an impact in other states and across the country. Well, just stay the course. I think that for any one of us, we are well-intentioned. But our intentions are insufficient without taking action steps to impact. And so I would just encourage folks to don't steer away from having what might be some challenging conversations, because these are conversations that need to be had as it relates to equity matters.